What is locality pay and how does it impact your salary as a federal employee? I'm Ian Smith with FedSmith.com, and the 2025 pay raise was recently announced just before the Christmas holiday. Locality pay is an important part of the general schedule pay system, but just how significant is it? I spoke with Ralph Smith, one of the FedSmith authors who's written extensively on this topic to help federal employees better understand this important feature of their salary. Ralph, thank you for taking the time to join me today to talk about locality pay.
Certainly. It's a pleasure to be here. Locality pay is one of my favorite topics because a lot of people like hearing about how much they're going to make.
And I'm sure it will be helpful for a lot of federal employees. They're anxious to know about their 2025 pay raise and how locality pay factors into that. With that in mind, locality pay can be a confusing topic for new federal employees or even for people who have worked for the government for a while. Can you talk about what locality pay is and how it's determined?
Yeah, locality pay is one of the benefits that people have who work for the federal government, at least under the GS pay scale. A lot of people don't think of it as a benefit, but it's actually one of the biggest benefits. And we've got some data we can talk about briefly today, and I'll put it up in an article coming out in FedSmith in a few days. Locality pay, or LPA for short, is just a way for the federal workforce to get higher salaries based upon a variety of factors, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it affects virtually all federal employees, including those in what's called the rest of the U.S. There's something like 705,000 employees in the rest of the U.S. locality pay area. That's usually the pay area that gets the least increase every year, but not always. Even for the people in the rest of the U.S., they actually start getting quite a bit more money over time because of the locality pay and how that system works.
Does it make that much of a difference to a federal employee's salary?
Yeah, it does, especially over time. When you look at the pay tables, OPM publishes them every year. They just published the 2025, and of course, you set up a link to them in one of your articles. But you look at, for example, the rest of the U.S., which is the least, and the rest of the U.S. has 17.06% added to the base pay table. That's the amount that comes in over time. That's how much the salary has increased. If you look at some of the other areas, for example, San Francisco, that pay area is one of the highest paid, and San Jose, also in the San Francisco area, their rate is 46.34%, and that's the amount that their pay has increased over what it would have been without locality pay since the locality pay has been in effect.
You mentioned that it does have a pretty big impact on a federal employee's salary over time. How many locality pay areas are there, first of all? And do you have any specific figures on what the impact is on a federal employee's salary over time? The impact that locality pay has, I mean, versus if you're not getting it or if you're in the rest of the US?
Sure. We don't have access to the kind of data that can perhaps be the most desirable for getting an exact figure. But first of all, with the number of locality pay areas, there are now 58. Now, it started out back in 1994 as 28 locality pay areas. Now it's up to 58, and a lot more people have been brought into locality pay areas because of the way that the system works and how they're defining locality pay areas. In terms of the impact that it has on a person's salary, over time, we've noticed just in one article that I wrote last year, I looked at a 5-year period. In some locality pay areas, the pay had gone up as much as 18 or 20%. In other areas, it was less. It was about 10%. So a lot depends on if you happen to live in San Francisco or Seattle, those are higher paid locality pay areas, or Washington, D.C., where the highest concentration of federal employees is located. They tend to be toward the top of the list every year. The rest of the U.S. tends to get less because of the various factors that the Federal Salary Council takes into account when it makes its recommendations for locality pay for the coming year.
Is cost of living what locality pay is based on? Like in terms of San Jose, we know has a much higher locality pay than, say, Huntsville, Alabama, or Miami. Is that because of cost of living, or how's it determined?
Not directly. In fact, in talking to a lot of people over a long time, most people, they think about locality pay, they think, or they make the argument, the cost of living in my city is higher than other cities that are already into the locality pay area. And that's not fair. The cost of living isn't the determining factor for setting up a locality pay area. The Federal Salary Council has listed various factors that they take into account. And I'm not going to try to do that from memory, but they primarily look at the pay disparity, if any, between federal and non federal salaries based on the jobs in that area. The second, they look at geographic boundaries. For example, Washington, D.C. now used to be an area that covered Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., and the D.C. suburbs in Maryland. Now you can be in the Washington, D.C. locality pay area, and you're actually living in West Virginia, at the far edge of West Virginia. Now, I had done some research recently, and I used to live in Alexandria, Virginia, so I know what the taxes are like there. They're very high. On the other hand, you could live in Hampshire, West Virginia. The taxes are about a half or a quarter of what they are in Alexandria. You still get the same locality pay if you're living in that far edge of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And that's because when they set it up, they look at MSAs and CSAs. And that's just a term used by census to look at, as the areas grow, what should we include into this locality pay area? So they look at a very broad area. And the way they've set it up in some areas, last year, for example, they approved a small area with some federal employees living out in the desert in Arizona as part of the Los Angeles Pay Area, where you're not going to commute from the desert in Arizona into Los Angeles to go into an office every day. You might, as long as you've got a good telephone service, maybe you're working at home. You can't commute. That would be a 4-hour drive each way, so you're be out of luck. In reality, you're not going to live, I don't think, in Hampshire, West Virginia, and commute into K Street downtown in D.C. Unless what you do, and some people I've worked with have done this, they'll rent an apartment, very small apartment with a bed and maybe a kitchen, and they'll live there during the week, and Friday afternoon they'll leave as quickly as they can and head back home and come back again on Sunday night. So that's an option.
Is that the idea? I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, is that the idea that is it based on a commute, or is it based on the idea that somebody might live there during the week and come back, or is telework what's causing this shift in the locality pay area regions to grow like that?
Not directly. We don't really know, other than what the Federal Salary Council publishes. It's possibly at least a factor that goes into it, because a lot of people, they could live in the far reaches of West Virginia and be part of the DC. They're in the DC area. They're not going to drive back and forth every day. That would be impractical. Instead, what they're looking at is the metropolitan statistical areas. And in effect, the Federal Salary Council is made up largely of unions, not all, but mostly. Their job, I think, as they see it, is to increase the benefits for federal employees as much as they can. One way to increase it is they can give a higher salary increase each year without going through Congress, but instead they make a recommendation to what's called the president's pay agent. The pay agent will typically, they always review it, they may approve it, and that oftentimes goes into effect when the president issues an executive order for the pay raise in the coming year. So it's a way to raise salaries without having to involve Congress. Congress could get involved. Some years they do, in most years they don't. They choose not to. But that's how the system works. And I know people are still complaining loudly in some cases about we're underpaid, and that may be true. I don't know. But you're still getting a pretty good increase. And I looked back when in 1994 was the first year we had locality pay areas. And the pay, if let's say you're a GS 12 step 5 living in the Washington pay area, your pay would have gone up between 1994 and 2025 about 142%, largely because of locality pay. So over time, obviously, that's a huge increase.
It makes a big difference. And we just found out a few days ago, at least based on the time we're recording this, that the 2025 federal pay raise came in at 2%. 1.7% of that was for the base pay increase, and then 0.3% went towards locality pay. Can you talk about that a little bit and how locality pay is going to factor into the 2025 pay raise and what impact it has?
Sure. And I went through and I looked at the areas that are going to be getting the biggest pay raise and those that are getting the smallest pay raise in 2025 for the locality pay areas. And the smallest area, or the least raised, the smallest raise coming through is places like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Corpus Christi, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale, and Houston. And in those areas, their pay raise is typically around 15.5%. That's the percentage of the change over time. And that's how much is being added in for their locality pay next year. Now, 1.8% will be going to employees in Cleveland, 1.9% in Cincinnati, 1.9% in Corpus Christi, and 1.9% and 1.91% in Houston. On the other end of the scale, that is the areas getting the highest salary increase, you've got San Diego, which is getting 2.21, DC 2.22, up to San Jose and San Francisco, which is the highest at 2.35. The rest of the U.S. is coming in at close to the low end, 1.91%. What people may not realize is over time, on Seattle, for example, 31.57% is the amount of the increase that's been added to the base pay for employees in this area over time.
Over how much time?
Well, honestly, I think since they became a locality pay area. I don't know when Seattle was added in. But since
I heard you mentioning like 31%, 15%, and I didn't want our viewers to think that you meant they were getting a 15% pay raise in 2025. So
that would be wishful thinking. It's likely to be the average, as you said, is 2%. In some locality pay areas, as I mentioned, Cleveland is getting 1.88, so they're getting less than the average, even though they're in a locality pay area. Other areas like San Jose, 2.35%. So the difference in percentage for 1 year isn't massive, 1.88 versus 2.35 between the highest and the lowest. But over time, San Jose, San Francisco have had a significant increase of more than 46%. Now, they've been in the locality pay area since 1994. So that's over time. Now, people may argue that's 25, 26, 30% less than it should be. Possibly. I don't have that information. But it has made a huge difference in the amount that individual federal employees are getting every year. The other aspect of that, and the president issues his alternative pay raise plan. It usually comes out, I think, in August. One of the things that he cites is that we're not having trouble recruiting new employees. I'm sure that depends on which agency you're talking about, but as a general rule, he doesn't implement what's called the Federal Employees
Pay Comparability
Act. If that were done, then there would be 28-30% pay increase going to every federal employee. With a $36 trillion deficit now sitting for the federal government, that's not going to happen. And it also doesn't take into account the benefits package, which is fairly generous. Mm-hmm. So it's a complex topic. The government does maintain control by the political appointees in the sense that the president's pay agent, which consists of the director of OMB, the director of OPM, and the secretary of labor, they look at what the Federal Salary Council proposes, and they'll say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't, for whatever reason they may have, and they explain that. So the political structure maintains some control over what the pay raise is going to be for a lot of employees. Do they add employees? Do they take employees out? One of the questions you asked earlier was about the commuting area. And it seemed like when this first started, the term commuting area was used a lot. Over time, that's had a much different meaning. I wrote an article for a paper in Vermont last year and was pointing out that when the Boston Locality Pay Area started in 1994, it included several cities around the Boston area. Locality Pay Area now includes places like Brattleboro and Bennington, Vermont. I lived in Vermont. I've driven to Boston in January and February, and it's not in the commuting area. It takes a long time, especially in the winter with the amount of snow they get and the cold temperatures. You can't logistically get to Boston from southern Vermont and on a regular basis. On a daily basis, you cannot do it. It'd be one of the cases where you rent an apartment in Boston, you stay there, and then you go home on Friday night. But that's not unique to Boston. That's pretty much true for all of the locality pay areas.
And you've written a number of articles on this too, and we'll be sure to include links in the description to those articles, especially the ones that have the tables you were talking about that show the percentage increases in pay and the impact locality pay has had on federal employee salaries over time for anyone who wants to get more information about that.
I hope people will look at articles if they have an interest in locality pay. FedSmith runs a series of articles as different events occur throughout the year and try to keep them advised of what's going on, what's happening, how it may affect them in their particular geographic area.
Thank you for taking the time to join me today to discuss locality pay. I appreciate it.
Thank you.